Welcome to this special Build to Rent edition of the Roundtable. We have a great lineup of guests as part of today's program, starting with Mark Fischer, co-founder and global head of real estate at Qualitas, Brian Farrelly, executive director at Fischer Partners, and David Hill, specialist in investments and alternative investments, I should say, at JLL. Gentlemen, great to have you on the panel. Josh, good to see you as always.
Bobby. Thanks for having us.
Mark, I wanted to start with you. In terms of the build-to-rent sector at Qualitas, when you look back at the past, say, 2 or 3 years, what was it that made Qualitas pull the trigger on investing alongside your partners in build-to-rent?
Sure. I mean, build-to-rent's something everyone's talked about for a decade or so when it was coming, and Australia would catch up with the rest of the world in build-to-rent. But we think a key part of any sector is about capital certainty, and we spent a lot of time thinking about how could we deliver that, and rather than buy the assets ahead of time and then work it out in the background, we thought if this is a multi-decade thematic in Australia, which we think it is, you have to have multi-decade capital available to you. So we spent a couple of years really focused on that, how to position it, lining up some things that we could bring to those investors, and then pulled the trigger last year and are well underway in the sector now.
And you went with Tim Gurner.
Sure.
Did you go, even from that perspective, did you go through a bit of a selection process as to who you were going to partner with to deliver on that BTR thematic?
Yeah, we did, and I'm sure Tim did the same in reverse as well. Yeah. But success in the sector is what I said. You've got to have the capital, you've got to have a customer base that you're focused on, and you've got to have the ability to deliver what that customer base wants. It's one of those real estate sectors where the end customer really matters. So the tenant living in the building is paramount, and we thought, based on all the research that we had done, the right demographic was 25 to 39-year-olds. And that was where the biggest pool of rental customers in Australia is currently and is going to be for the foreseeable future. And who were the developers who really understood that market and had proven they can deliver what that cohort wants, right? And that's how we landed with Tim. I think he's got an excellent track record in delivering into that cohort. And I think the combination of us together is quite powerful.
And then Brian, from your perspective, Fischer Partners obviously deals with a lot of high net worth individuals. Tell us about your exposure to the build to rent sector and what you're seeing across the space at the moment.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we've got a huge range of fantastic clients, high net worth, but in particular across the property industry. So we deal with a range of developers, finances, construction, everything from architecture and up. We're seeing probably twofold. We're seeing a lot of inquiry and interest from investors, and we're seeing a lot of inquiry and interest from developers. But then in addition to that, we're assisting quite a lot with the structuring and setup of some of these BTR structures and projects. So it's exciting. It's certainly very much in its infancy from what we can see, and you're starting with some of these structures and designs from scratch, really. In some cases, we were dealing with a tax and a regime across the board that really isn't designed specifically for BTR, and a little bit outdated in that respect, hasn't been able to keep up with the industry. And
so have things changed a lot, would you say, in the last, say, 12 months? In terms of government's understanding, the ATO's understanding, and then obviously educating people like the banks on how these projects should get up?
Piecemeal, I'd say. Yeah, they're not certainly initial steps. Yeah. I think it's a bit of retrofitting when it comes to trying to fix the state taxes and the federal tax system to deal with these sorts of projects. So we've seen some good inroads from New South Wales and Victoria with respect to land tax and the discounts available there, which I can talk to. But it's there's a long way to go, in my opinion.
I think a lot of people talk about tax as a major constraint to the development of the sector, and it's not ideal, it's not efficient, there's a lot of work that can be done, but it hasn't stopped it. We've now got major global investors who are saying we like the thematic so much, notwithstanding the tax inefficiencies, that we're going to invest in this for decades in Australia. And I think that was a story of a couple of years ago, that tax was really a real constraint. I don't think it is anymore. I think people have moved beyond it. Let's hope it gets fixed and we're all going to do better and it grows even further, but I don't think it's going to stop.
But do you think, Fish, that it keeps the market, the pool of players, somewhat constrained, and the ability to grow that market is somewhat limited because of some of those limitations? I mean, it's strictly institutional
capital, right? Yeah. The cost of capital required with that tax impost is institutional. So I think it limits it to an institutional market. But I think I think ultimate success in that sector is probably institutional anyway, because you need scale, and you need scale not only because of what the returns look like, but I think you need scale to get data about your customers and what they want to see in their buildings and efficiencies in operation. And so, setting out on a build-to-rent strategy and saying I'm going to have a portfolio of 300 to 500 apartments, you make a little bit of money, but this is about 3,000 and 5,000 apartments to really get success in it.
And what's your objective, just out of interest?
So we've closed our first fund, which I think is well flagged. That gave us $1.2 billion of firepower. We're on a program with that investor base towards $3 billion of firepower. So it depends how much skew we've got between Sydney, Melbourne and Sydney and other places around Australia. But ultimately we'll get to probably 3,000 apartments.
David, I want to bring you in here. You've led a number of high-profile advisory mandates. Talk to us about some of the conversations that you're having with your clients at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think going back to the start of sort of build to rent and when we first started hearing about it in Australia, it's probably going sort of a bit over 3 years ago now. And I like to sort of use the example that I was probably on a call a week, I think, with international capital, looking at the sector exactly as the gentleman here have sort of said around, looking at tax structures, the preliminary work to get confidence that it is an investable option for global capital. That escalated to probably 24 months ago when I was spending probably 3 to 6 hours a day on calls with global capital. So exponential interest in the sector. That foundation work had been done. Now it was about this race to achieving scale. So developing these strategies around how they can roll out these platforms around the country, and then talking about sort of target locations, and probably no surprises, Eastern Seaboard's really been sort of the preliminary interest. But that being said, because of the nature of build to rent, there's huge opportunities in other markets as well around Australia, the likes of Canberra, which is a very transient sort of rental market, Adelaide, Perth, etc., as focuses as well. So we sort of talk about, obviously very established mature markets in the US, the UK, in terms of multifamily and BTR. And then at Australia level, it's really feeding into that living sector's opportunity. So in Australia, that started with student accommodation, which over the last sort of 5 years has resulted in over sort of $3.5 billion of transactions in the last couple of years. Now they're looking to fill out these pieces of the living sectors, so into co-living, build to rent. But build to rent sits in a way in a sort of its own sort of basket there in the living sectors, because it's driven, as Mark was saying, larger sort of customer profile, structurally lower return profile. But if you look at performance over the last 2 years in a global pandemic, it's proven such a resilient sector.
Well, it's the biggest sector in the US in terms of tradable transactions that take place every year beyond any other sector. So it seems like we've got a long way to go. And your background, obviously coming from student accommodation, I would have thought the platform, or at least the metrics that you go about working out whether something is going to fly, would be somewhat similar. Exactly. And I think a lot of the people at the moment, from our perspective in doing deals on the land, everyone's forgetting about the operation of these things for the next 10, 20 years. Yes, it's this much to build them and this is where it's located, but projecting those cash flows and understanding where the rental growth is going to come from, I think that's the real skill that you've brought to the table when we sell a site now. Being able to have that conversation is not about, how much can you sell the flats for and when can you get out of the project. The whole narrative's changed, and also the time it takes to have a conversation and investigate the site has changed as well.
Absolutely. I mean, the deals we're doing together, it's about that sort of the 10 years from operations where we're forecasting out rental growth, looking at rental rates, and a lot of work goes into that underwrite to then work backwards towards the site value, essentially. So a lot of the conversations we're having when we're doing a deal is around the comfort of those assumptions once these things are operational. And as Mark was saying as well, it's about that operational efficiency and the focus on the end customer, which really drives those assumptions going forward. So for what's at the moment, in an infancy of a sector and largely driven by site sales, as the sector emerges, we're already talking in such a sort of a sophisticated fashion around the operational element of these, which is driving sort of the emergence of that market. So working backwards.
I was just saying, one thing we've seen that's come out of exactly that point is the concept of the threat of future supply. So often when people are doing build to sell, you get in, what your supply is around you, permits coming, other people selling and launching, and you've got a very short window that you're dealing with it. When we're looking at this stuff now, we're thinking about supply over a decade and how is our building going to stack up against that site down the street that might be built in 5 years' time, and it's the new kid on the block, and everyone wants to rent there, and how will our building stand up against that? Which is a very different way of thinking. I think it's leading to due diligence is a bit longer and a bit harder, and you know, transaction times, unfortunately for Josh, are probably a bit longer. But I think it's the nature of the investing that people are doing. It's long term.
Can we talk, just sorry to jump in, can we talk a little bit about rental growth? I'm really curious to know, you know, you do a lot of reports for groups like Mark about, you know, what sort of profile we're dealing with in the area, how we can project where the rents are going to head. And it's a difficult one, I understand it would be for any sector, not just residential, but we are in an interesting paradigm at the moment where we are seeing that rents should increase because of the supply-demand imbalance of residential accommodation. How do you sort of formulate a view on a site, Mark, when we really don't have much data to work with? I'm imagining there's a lot of international precedent and other things, but we're dealing in Australia, we're dealing in a world where we're coming away from, you know, the great Australian dream of owning your own home. How do we project what that rental growth will be? Because that's ultimately what's going to drive the viability of these projects.
Sure, and not only that, but try setting your starting rents. That's the other big conundrum, because a lot of, particularly the approach we're taking, we're looking at neighbourhoods where there's existing amenity that we want to leverage off of, but perhaps there's not a whole lot of scale of high density apartments. And so you're looking at comps for rental that might not really be comps, and how do I even get to setting my starting rental? And I think there's no other way than rolling up your sleeves and doing the hard work on it. Yeah. So I think we get very comfortable about where starting rents are. The growth aspect is a tougher one for sure. I think we've been very modest in what we think about growth. This is not a type of investment where people are shooting for build-to-sell style returns. You're shooting for long-term, I've said it a few times, multi-decade type returns, and you don't have to shoot the lights out on growth to get the numbers to work. And I think you're better off being modest in your assumptions, and then hopefully giving your investors a great surprise down the track when this all takes off.
But in the words of Andrew Schwartz, the opportunities are going to be in those assets that bring rental growth to them. We can't rely on cap rate compression for the next 10 years. So clearly Qualitas have taken a position that this is going to be a rental growth driven market. And even if it's modest, you think there's going to be, in comparison to all other sectors, a reasonable return for the investors in that regard.
Yeah, no, I think to get any set of maths to work in this sector, you have to assume a level of rental growth. My point was probably more, if you're needing to assume 4, 5, 6% rental growth to get it to work, I think good luck. You know, we're sitting in the 2 to 3% rental growth, and I think efficient, well-managed buildings are going to be able to deliver that over a decade-long period. Now, it might run really hard because we're going to reopen the border and you'll get 4, 5, 6%. Then guess what? There might be a supply shock and it comes back for a little while. And you're trying to look through some of that and pick something over a long period of time that you should be able to deliver.
Brian, just from a tax perspective, what are the implications from a tax perspective on the built-to-rent sector, and what are some of the concessions that are available?
Look, I think the tax factors that impact BTR are probably twofold. One in the context of capital and investors and the viability around concessions that are offered to them to come on board. So very limited in that space, really, to be honest. Particularly with respect to, we've got this managed investment trust regime which provide concessions for withholding to offshore investors. That doesn't apply in the context of BTR as it currently stands.
Big talking point, isn't it?
Yeah, a huge talking point.
Has been for a while.
Yeah, and I think this is obviously comes down to just an understanding of where does this project and where does this product actually sit. It's not residential, it's not commercial. Is it commercial residential? Well, the limited definition that sits for the purpose of tax rules just doesn't apply in that context. So, you know, there's going to be further talk, and I think this is part of what we're seeing at the moment in structuring these deals is we know there's going to be change. There has to be. There's a lot of talk in the space. Making sure we've got a structure that has flexibility enough to be able to adapt to those changes, not locking ourselves into a path where, you know, future capital is going to be hindered because of, you know, not being able to access future concessions. So
where does student accommodation sit though at the moment?
It's commercial residential, so that's fine.
So that's fine.
Yeah,
and you'd have to think that they're pretty closely aligned. So as you say, it sounds like it's just a matter of time before logic prevails.
Right? We've got a government at the moment that took a decision and had a policy position around it. There's no political capital in changing that. Right? They're not going to do it to please Qualitas and other institutional investors at this point in time. We need a change in the political cycle for it to happen, and whether that's 6 months, 2 years or 5 years away, time will tell.
Indeed. And look, the other area is just in relation to the actual operation, so your land tax and getting off the ground with stamp duty as well. Again, that doesn't really help in the context of foreign investors. There's all these surcharges, land tax can double, more than double. Stamp duty can be as high as 15% with foreign investors. Again, we're talking about the low cost base on the land up front, so it's not as a huge a hindrance, but ongoing land tax on value is huge. Whether we're talking about 4.5%, 4.75% on market value year on year is a big difference to the IRR on some of these deals. So there's what we're seeing is helpful in the land tax space with respect to New South Wales and Victoria coming forward and providing 50% concessions, but albeit Victoria's less onerous, it's still a 30-year exemption. You need to have it in place for 15 years. You need to be offering 3-year tenancies to your tenants. You need to have more than 50 dwellings on a single lot. There's a few.
And Dave, do you think that's what slowed down the uptake of BTR in places like Brisbane, for example? I know they're talking about it now, but Melbourne and Sydney have led the way, Melbourne predominantly, and maybe to you, Fish, as well. Has that stopped you guys looking up in the northern states for BTR?
I think Mark addressed this before. The activity we see in the sector. I mean, the pathway to entering the sector started some years ago.
Yeah.
So it's been a nice to have in Victoria, or will be nice to have in Victoria and New South Wales. I don't think it's prohibiting anyone from looking at Queensland at this point. All it's going to do is, I think, improve returns. But I think the capital has comfort around where that profile sat coming into the sector. And maybe some are factoring in changes in time, but I don't think it's great to have a lead, absolutely, and it sort of to a degree shows government support for the sector and recognition that it's going to be a big investment sector. But I don't think it's a make or break. In time, I think the other states will follow suit.
Mark, I'd be interested to get your view on how Qualitas is positioning itself to capitalise on opportunities that may present themselves this year. Walk us through the listing of the business towards the back end of last year and how that's assisted in your pipeline moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I touched on it in answering Josh's question before about aspiration and where we've headed. We've set up on a program that can ultimately deliver us about $3 billion worth of assets in the build-to-rent space. And in order to do that, I think you need to be able to align yourselves with your investors and keep up with co-investment. Institutional investors have more money than most local players, but they want to know that you're aligned and the people making the decisions for them have some skin in the game, as they call it. And I think as Qualitas as a business has grown significantly, we always have demands on our own capital. And so we took a decision to raise capital into the business for the purposes of making co-investment alongside our investors in the fund, and also giving us flexibility to secure things when timing doesn't quite work for the fund. So that was an important thing for us. That said, we raised our build to rent capital without that in place. So I think if I was to join those two together, I think it's going to allow us to raise further capital in build to rent over the coming years. We've got to deploy what we've got at the moment, obviously, but that'll allow us to just really scale up.
Is it a big sell job at the moment though? You're finding you have to really convince some of that capital around the merits of BTR, or because a lot of them are offshore, they've sort of seen it in their respective investments in, say, the US or the UK?
Yeah. Look, I think the ones that you want to be dealing with get it. They understand it. What they want to know is, well, what's your edge? What's your proposition compared to the other 6 people, or probably more like 60 people who have knocked on my door with the same proposition? Yeah. And so we focused very heavily on what is different about what we're doing. And it goes back to what I said before. Our proposition is to combine core investment management capability, which Qualitas has, with what Tim Gurner and his team bring on the core product and development capability. And I think that's a relatively unique proposition in the market, because you need both to be successful in the space. So I don't think we're educating people about how much of a great idea build to rent is. It's about what's your proposition, what do you want to do, how you're going on that, and how can we work together. Yeah.
David, what about threats? What threats to the sector do you see, or what challenges do you foresee?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, the current framework from a taxation perspective is, it is what it is sort of thing. It's not a threat as such, because it's a known issue, but I think that was one of the first sort of questions to be answered once there was comfort in that. Obviously, entry into the sector. I mean, it's an unproven model largely at the moment in terms of in the Australian market from a rental acceptance perspective, right? So the actual, the customer market, what have we got? We've got service departments, student accommodation, hotels, etc., which prove a rental model to a degree. But I think once we start seeing the first of these, dedicated build-to-rent assets entering the market, there'll be this general level of acceptance that the market appreciates what it is, what it provides, the convenience, the flexibility, and I think, using a Melbourne example, so Home's asset on City Road, which is going to be completed shortly. Open doors will be a really big thing for the market to say, there's acceptance, we're achieving the rates we set out to achieve. It's a proven model. I think at that point it gives the confidence of global capital to say, here's some examples we can point to. They've hit the rents they set out to achieve in their underwrite. There's that general acceptance. I think we'll see a wave coming in. So, we've got sites, the supply pipeline's building, but I think that acceptance from an operational perspective will be big. Next step forward. Right, not going to be a challenge, but next step forward to sort of shore it up.
I agree. The biggest threat is someone makes a horrible mistake and gets it totally wrong. And it's sort of incumbent on all the players to not let it get to that. Don't let someone do something really silly on a deal because it will infect the industry.
You're all in it together,
Correct.
in a sense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We want everyone to succeed. So.
Yeah, you need Home to have that launch in City Road and to be successful and
You
get
need
that
agents
rent.
to give you off-market deals. We'll talk about it later.
Just in terms of policy settings, and we don't have to get too political here, but is your sense that you're getting supported from a state level and not from a federal level at all?
Interestingly, we advised the Victorian government on their sort of land tax position, revision of, which was, I think, a good step forward. I think now that the states are progressing that discussion, they're eager to learn about the sector and understand the drivers. I think now will be the point of state lobbying federal to come to the party, come to the table, discuss it, and move forward. So I think we're confident that there will be, everyone will come and to the party, see the benefit of the sector, understand what it delivers, from a political perspective as well, of increasing supply of rental accommodation and the quality, because at the end of the day, build to rent, the product itself has to be best in class. You can't go and deliver a substandard asset because the whole model is built on recurring rental income. So if you deliver a substandard building with substandard operations, you're going to lose your market because they'll go to your competitor. So there isn't much room for error, which I think is a great thing, generally speaking.
But it feels like the answer to all of their prayers, because it increases housing supply, it increases the quality of housing, the whole affordability crisis could be somewhat alleviated because there is more stock in the market. People can rent comfortably, they know they've got security of tenure. Shouldn't they just be jumping all over it from a government perspective?
Yeah.
Or are you feeling that is a slow burn and it's happening?
I think, there's always an educational period where they've got to get their heads around what it is, what it means from a policy and taxation perspective. Also, again, having that proof of concept, which we'll see as more assets are delivered, I think will help at a policy level. I think they'll come to the party, as you say. There's so many benefits of it. You can point around the world to the US multifamily sector, which has been around for decades. It would be remiss not to think it's going to.
I think the one that confuses it, though, is when people say it's going to create supply and therefore it's going to fix the affordability thing. You cannot get the mathematics to work dealing with affordable rentals. So it's going to increase supply, but you're still dealing with someone with a lot of disposable income who can afford to pay high rents in a whole of city context. And I think that's where some of the mismatch with government has gone. People start talking about affordability and what they think of as affordability and what we mean when we say it's going to increase supply and deal with affordability. Different things. It's not affordable.
But doesn't the rising tide lift all ships, in the sense that if I'm living in a decent building but then I go into your building because I'm happy to pay a bit more, everyone can potentially, it creates vacancy in the building I left, so everyone's slightly upgraded.
The lead time's very long on that, though. Sure. I think my view of where it heads from a policy perspective, and I guess no one really knows, is there will be planning or tax concessions that come in for build to rent, but as a condition of doing that, there'll be some true affordable housing requirements. So you'll get a bonus on floor space, you'll get some land tax relief, but guess what? You're putting X% in as truly affordable housing and they'll be locked up for 30 years. something like that. I think that because that will win votes, right?
Yeah.
And it's instant. It's an instant impact. It's not to your point. The rising tide will take years and cycles, and I think it's much harder for politicians.
So do you see that as a requirement or as an incentive? Because I think there are risks associated, and I know they've done it globally, of having a requirement of an affordability component in an asset, which, you know, it addresses an issue, but I don't think it's always, you know, appropriate. Particularly, you know, you're probably cutting out a large number of groups who won't touch anything like that. But I think having the incentive as an option, while not being a requirement, is probably the path forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's very easy for me to say this. It should be an incentive, right? Because I think it makes getting the sector and scale actually fixes the problem. Because if it's an obligation on a developer, it only does one thing: push the land value down, right? And then I'm suddenly cannot buy compared to build to sell, as an example. So I get why it makes sense for government to make it an obligation. I'm just not sure it works in the commercial reality. But I think what is affordable is the good conversation as well. Like we use it's the nurses and the teachers type affordable. You want them in your building, right? You want, people use the buzzword community, right? Creating a community in your building. But it's actually true. You want that mix of people who are actually creating the place to live, so that when the next prospective tenant comes along, the place has a buzz about it. The people are happy, they're talking to the guy on the concierge desk and they know him like he's a mate, right? You need all of that in there. And so I think that definition of affordable in buildings is a fantastic thing.
Yeah.
I think, on the affordability end of the spectrum, I think the only way it can really work is through sort of partnerships with government. So looking at, government land agencies that are big landowners, looking at structuring or partnerships where they're, depending on location product, but say take a VicTrack, for instance, that has land around train stations. Look at a partnership that, that makes the numbers work essentially to deliver it, because playing in a private market, for affordable housing, it's never going to stack up to the upper end of the market. So that needs to be government-led, and it needs to be, it needs to be, the opportunities need to be there, and they need to be willing to, formulate opportunities through those partnerships to drive that sector. Otherwise, I find it very hard to.
Oh well, you're sitting with them every month. No pressure. You can force that through. I just had a really quick one on funding.
Sure.
Has the landscape changed in terms of the bank's approach to how a build-to-rent project gets out of the ground? Because I remember early on when Sam Tarascio and others were trying to make it an industry that works. This is 3 or 4 years ago now. The banks was a big hurdle, and trying to get funding secured at the right time was a big hurdle. Has that changed at all with the Australian banks?
Given the nature of my business, we've got a foot in both camps on this, right? So we have a dedicated fund, quite distinct from us as a owner and manager of build-to-rent, that provides loans to developers. So we raised a fund to do that. We've made some investments in that fund, and that's really targeted at that private developer we talked about before, who maybe wants a little bit more leverage in their structure compared to what an institution would want, but really is focused and committed to build-to-rent. So we, as a non-bank financier in the other side of our business, are doing that. That's very active. It's changed. I would say there's a bit of competition in that space. We're not the only non-bank financier who's doing it. But then you flip to the other side, where the equity is institutional and typically looking for a bit lower leverage than a private might look. We funded our deal so far in the program with Australian banks, which has been good. Took a while, but they were committed. They rolled up their sleeves. They really want to understand it. I think they've got past the concept of, do we want to be involved? And then now, what is my policy? What is all the procedures? What are the rules of us as a bank that we want to do in this sector, which is great. So it's slow to get a deal done, but they're definitely there to do deals. Yeah.
I think an interesting point as well. I mean, back in the early days of student accommodation, we were working a lot with our clients, investors, and the banks, trying to educate them around product, operations, etc., before they enter the market. And the number one question was, well, what's the alternate use if the sector doesn't get off the ground? What do I do with a building? Now, student accommodation, which is also very closely aligned in design to co-living, very efficient room sizes, pretty much no opportunity to strata and sell down if as an alternate use. So our response was, if you don't believe in the sector, don't invest in it. Now, obviously, build to rent is a more sort of residential aligned product. I think that's really helped with the comfort. They can visualise it. It's just that. Yeah, it's just an easier task, because we saw banks just flat out wouldn't enter student accommodation too hard sort of basket.
Yep.
I think BTR has a lot more scope to have all the players in
Easy
there.
to swallow. Yep. Yep.
Mark, Brian, David, pleasure having each of you on the panel as part of this episode, and wish you and your businesses all the best for the year ahead. Josh, good to see you as always, and look forward to the next episode.
Thank you.